After World War II, the United States discovered with amazement the extent of Nazi experiments aimed at manipulating the human mind. On the sites of certain concentration camps, documents revealed techniques of forced hypnosis, administration of unknown substances, and extreme behavioral conditioning. In the immediate post-war period, the priority was to understand these practices so as never to be outpaced by a foreign power in the race for information. American officials, still shocked by the discovery of the atrocities of the Hitler regime, convinced themselves that it was imperative to develop both innovative and effective counter-interrogation methods. At the same time, the rising Cold War reinforced this sense of urgency. The United States grew concerned over persistent rumors that the Soviet Union possessed advanced knowledge in the field of brainwashing. This expression, frequently used in the American press, fueled the collective fear of a communist ideology capable of completely reprogramming an individual. American intelligence officials feared that a soldier captured by the enemy could be turned against his own country. The prospect of such a scenario pushed the state apparatus to consider extreme solutions and large-scale research. The concrete example of the Korean War, which began in 1950 and ended in 1953, illustrates the depth of this concern. On the ground, several American soldiers fell into the hands of communist forces and returned home with troubling testimonies. Some claimed to have undergone intensive interrogations and returned with doubts about their own beliefs. Others seemed converted to enemy propaganda, increasing the astonishment of the American government. In this climate, the official doctrine formed around the idea that the Soviets, or even the Chinese, possessed ultra-sophisticated methods of psychological manipulation capable of transforming an individual. This atmosphere of widespread suspicion paved the way for the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, in 1947, right after the signing of the National Security Act by President Harry S. Truman. In this new institutional landscape, Allen Dulles played a determining role. He became director of the CIA in 1953 and consolidated the doctrine that later bore his name. According to this doctrine, anything seemed permissible to protect the American nation, even if it involved large-scale clandestine operations. This philosophy justified the notion that the end, the safeguarding of national security, could excuse morally questionable means. CIA officials then drew inspiration from recent medical discoveries and promising psychiatric research to conceive new interrogation and mental influence processes. Included in their focus were techniques like hypnotic suggestibility, lie detection through chemical psychological methods, and the use of hallucinogenic substances to alter subjects' perceptions. The trauma linked to Nazi advancements served as a warning. It was no longer just about espionage, but understanding how a human being could be pushed to reveal their most intimate secrets or even adopt behaviors contrary to their interests. The stakes went beyond the simple military framework. 3.0. Among the initiatives launched at the beginning of the 1950s were two crucial projects that directly preceded MKUltra: Bluebird and Artichoke. Bluebird, initiated as early as 1950, aimed to explore all forms of interrogation techniques, including hypnotic induction and psychological destabilization. CIA agents tested combinations of narcotics, set up scenarios to provoke feelings of helplessness in subjects, and studied the effects of prolonged isolation. In 1951, Artichoke took over. It was a more ambitious program that included the use of new drugs capable of blocking the will or inducing amnesia. The underlying principle of these projects was to identify vulnerable psychological profiles and test various protocols on them. Volunteers, when there were any, often received only partial information, and many subjects did not even know they were participating in a government experiment. In some cases, captives or psychiatric hospital patients were placed in extreme situations of hypnosis or injection of chemical cocktails. Researchers hoped to determine the mental breaking point beyond which the subject would lose all resistance. This research logic was based on a utilitarian view where the national cause justified almost everything. At this stage, the financial means to support these projects prove significant and are the subject of meticulous concealment. The CIA avoids congressional oversight by creating shell entities and going through private foundations, supposedly financing innocuous research. University laboratories and pharmaceutical companies turn out to be complicit, sometimes unknowingly, by accepting grants for medical research or experimental psychology programs. The lack of parliamentary supervision opens the door to all sorts of abuses. Operations multiply in almost total opacity, and only a few senior agency officials know the true extent of the experiments. In this picture, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb holds a special place. A chemist by training, he quickly joins the ranks of the CIA and becomes the central figure in research on psychotropic substances. He is fascinated by the possibility of manipulating the human mind using drugs that induce hallucinations or temporarily erase memory. Gottlieb then oversees a diverse team. Psychiatrists, psychologists, biochemists, and hypnotists collaborate to develop unprecedented protocols. In his view, the best way to paralyze an adversary is to deeply disturb their mind without leaving easily detectable external evidence. LSD, whose hallucinogenic properties were discovered in 1943 by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, particularly attracts Gottlieb's attention. In the United States, the substance is still little known, but Gottlieb sees it as a revolutionary way to break an individual's mental defenses. In this context, he multiplies tests, first on military personnel, then on individuals unaware of the true nature of the product. These practices generate keen interest from some senior CIA officers, who urge Gottlieb and his team to push their investigations further through a series of secret projects. At the same time, the CIA remains concerned about the potential gap created by the Soviet Union in this race for mental domination. Agency officials gather rumors about secret laboratories in Siberia or research institutes specializing in military psychology in Moscow. Although the accuracy of such information remains uncertain, it suffices to fuel paranoia within American decision-making circles. The culture of secrecy feeds on these uncertainties. It is better to conduct extensive research to anticipate any future threat, even if tangible evidence is sometimes lacking. Over the months, the obsession with not falling behind the Soviets becomes a leitmotif for the CIA. Every scientific or pseudoscientific discovery is scrutinized, whether it is a new form of electroconvulsive therapy or a more powerful sedative. Budgets allocated to this research increase significantly, and successive agency directors insist on absolute discretion. The few legal advisors aware of the operations only offer mild reservations, as national priority prevails over ethical considerations. This dynamic reinforces the idea that a secret war is taking place in the shadows, requiring unconventional measures. The international context further fuels this climate of mutual distrust. In Eastern Europe, political trials show defendants confessing to improbable crimes, maintaining the idea that the Soviets have indeed found a way to enforce mental submission. American diplomats abroad report anecdotes about individuals suddenly becoming docile under the pressure of veiled threats. Within the U.S. Department of State, some believe that traditional interrogation methods are obsolete. It is urgent to develop psychological weapons capable of breaking any resistance. This vision justifies increasingly audacious secret programs. The ideological roots of these programs resonate deeply within American society of the time. The post-war period is marked by an increased feeling of vulnerability, fueled by the memory of Nazi atrocities and the growing fear of the communist bloc. The idea of gaining an advantage over the enemy through scientific and psychological means seems legitimate, even necessary. Newspapers regularly mention the notion of hidden subversion, and Hollywood seizes on the theme in films depicting government conspiracies. Thus, federal authorities consider their actions in the country's best interest, even though the moral implications remain highly complex and controversial. At the dawn of the 1950s, everything seemed to be in place for the launch of a more ambitious project, systematically exploiting chemistry, psychology, and the fear of the enemy. The Bluebird and Artichoke programs paved the way for more radical experiments, while Sidney Gottlieb embodied the zeal of new mind control techniques. In this context of international rivalries, institutional paranoia, and power without true checks and balances, the advent of MK Ultra became inevitable. The agency was preparing to take a crucial step in the history of American intelligence. We are at the heart of experiments conducted in utmost secrecy, and the main challenge consists of finding the chemical combination or psychological method that would allow them to influence an individual's thoughts without them realizing it. The program leaders administered significant quantities of psychotropic substances, and the most emblematic remained LSD, discovered a few years earlier and quickly perceived as a potential psychic weapon. They injected it or had it ingested by poorly informed volunteers, but also by people who had absolutely no knowledge of what they were being subjected to. They experimented with chemical cocktails, sometimes mixing LSD with barbiturates or stimulants like amphetamines, in the hope of provoking even more intense reactions and observing if, at a certain stage, the subject's personality could be manipulated. The official aim remained to test mental resistance or find a way to alter behavior to extract information or program an individual, but the methods deployed rarely followed any clear ethical guidelines, as most trials were conducted without explicit consent and without explanation. The experimenters also resorted to scopolamine, known for its effects on memory and the confusion it can create, and they did not hesitate to add experimental sedatives to the list, always in search of the ideal formula. The trials took place in psychiatric hospitals, where already vulnerable patients, often unable to give informed consent, became easy targets. Prisoners, already deprived of liberty, were also used as guinea pigs, sometimes in exchange for promised but not always honored sentence reductions. Some students or ordinary citizens were recruited through fake advertisements or concealed research contracts. Occasionally, members of government staff underwent tests without their knowledge, under the pretext of routine medical checks. All these subjects received no precise information about the nature of the substances administered to them, nor about the real objectives of the study, and often found themselves plunged into states of terror, psychosis, or lasting confusion. In some cases, the dose was administered repeatedly, day after day, or even at unpredictable intervals, creating a climate of anxiety and mental insecurity. The experimenters sought to determine the maximum tolerable dose without leading to death, while trying to trigger psychic break phenomena that could shed light on how to break down a person's mental defenses. At this stage, sensory isolation proved to be a valuable tool for researchers aiming to weaken the mind. They kept an individual in a room without natural light, deprived of any sound cues, sometimes forced to wear opaque glasses or a headset, broadcasting constant white noise. Sessions extended over days, even weeks. Subjects gradually lost their sense of time, and the experimenters observed the mental fragility that set in, hoping this state of confusion could allow for a reformatting of thought. Sound bombardment, alternated with long periods of oppressive silence, reinforced this approach, as did the projection of continuous bright lights in cramped rooms devoid of comfort elements. They also explored suggestion through deep hypnosis, with the idea of planting instructions in the subject's mind without their knowledge, either to make them accept orders or to trigger later behavior when a keyword was heard. One of the central objectives was to create what the leaders termed total programming, a state where the individual is either entirely amnesic upon waking or capable of carrying out a task dictated by the experimenter without remembering it afterward. Sleep manipulation was also part of these psychic break techniques. The participant is artificially sedated with a powerful sedative, then awakened several times by painful stimuli or aggressive sounds, before being drugged again to plunge back into the darkness of unconsciousness. This disorienting alternation between forced sleep and abrupt awakening aims to erase the usual mental structure and create a state of extreme vulnerability, in which it is sometimes easier to implant suggestions. Extreme experiments aimed at building programmable agents seek to determine whether it is possible to trigger conditioned responses in an individual that remain buried in their mind until a specific signal brings them out. Attempts are made to induce total amnesia, so that the person knows nothing of their training. Methods are also tested to fragment the personality by creating artificial alter egos, or attempting to impose different mental identities under different triggering conditions. The idea of erasing an individual's will is no longer a science fiction fantasy for those in charge, but a field of study they approach coolly. They document everything they observe, from heart rate to violent reactions of anxiety or hallucination, sometimes without much concern for the irreversible psychological damage. The partner institutions are diverse and often chosen for the reputation of their researchers, who sometimes are unaware of the true source of their funding. Universities like McGill in Canada then host projects funded by foundations whose mission seems purely philanthropic. Dr. Ewan Cameron, a renowned psychiatrist, leads work on the deconstruction of the human psyche in an attempt to treat certain mental disorders, but his research is quickly co-opted as it offers a particularly suitable ground for the program's strategies. In his laboratories, they practice prolonged isolation, massive use of sedatives, and the hypnotic repetition of messages played to a patient hundreds of times until they no longer really grasp the meaning. These works, officially intended for healing, are actually used to perfect mind control techniques. Hospitals also agree, in exchange for generous budgets, to make their patients available as test subjects, and federal prisons sign agreements allowing test protocols to be applied to inmates in exchange for funding rarely monitored by higher authorities. These practices are hidden behind innocuous research titles that reassure the public. To cover financial flows, the program uses shell companies and fictitious foundations, thus diverting suspicion. Only a few officials at the highest level really know who is behind the contracts. Very few elements leak outside the restricted circle, and the U.S. Congress has virtually no means of controlling what is happening. Security measures are drastic, documents are often classified, and communication between collaborators sometimes takes place via diverted channels to leave no official trace. The climate of secrecy is reinforced when internal lapses appear. This is the case of the death of Frank Olson, a scientist working on programs related to biological weapons who, according to official reports, committed suicide in 1953. In reality, it seems the man ingested LSD without his knowledge during a meeting, then found himself plunged into extreme psychological distress. The exact circumstances of his fatal fall from a hotel window remain murky. Immediately, the reflex is to conceal the ins and outs of this affair, for fear of drawing attention to the shadiest aspects of the program. It is said that even influential members within the government know nothing of the experience that may have pushed Olson to the brink of madness, and only internally, around a small group, do they understand the magnitude of the danger. This death, much publicized later, illustrates the brutality of the research conducted and the total lack of safeguards. The other brewing scandal is the lack of complete and transparent documentation. When fearing that investigative committees might start questioning the morality and legality of these practices, the decision is made to destroy some of the evidence. Official documents, stored in highly secure locations, are shredded or burned, leaving incomplete archives that only provide a partial picture of the extent of the experiments. Certain sections of the government, poorly informed, have no idea that such operations are happening right under their noses, and continue to fund, without knowing, programs not aimed at conventional medical research, but at the development of interrogation techniques based on psychological destruction. In this context, it is understandable that the experiments are not limited to a single laboratory or an isolated group of scientists. Over the years, reputable psychiatric clinics, federal hospitals, and even military detention centers have become testing grounds. The officials have doctors sign strict confidentiality agreements, and those who agree to collaborate are handsomely paid. Meanwhile, the subjects, often destitute, find no way to escape methods that transform their lives. Some have permanent sequelae in the form of psychotic flashbacks or deep memory loss. Others, especially among the prisoners, undergo such levels of stress and confusion that they end up abandoning all resistance. There is talk of depersonalization, dissolution of consciousness, without anyone bothering to provide adequate clinical follow-up. The doctors or researchers involved sometimes claim that these are scientific experiments aimed at understanding the nature of psychosis, while their real objective is to discover ways to eradicate psychological resistance. Some projects also involve combining the intake of LSD or other psychotropics with prolonged interrogation sessions. The hypothesis is that the subject, under the influence of these drugs, would become destabilized and more likely to confess secret information or reveal sensitive data. In rooms that resemble cells, the person is then confronted repeatedly, playing on physical exhaustion and sensory distortion until lucidity weakens. The experimenters note the questions and answers, evaluating the accuracy of memory under psychotropics. They seek the flaw, the moment when the subject no longer has the ability to resist or lie, in the hope that the truth will emerge. At certain moments, the line blurs between what is a medical project and a human engineering project designed to generate specific behaviors. Internal reports indicate more than unusual techniques. Electrode helmets intended to disrupt brain activity, or sessions of food deprivation during which, unexpectedly, a hallucinogen is administered that can plunge the victim into nightmarish scenarios. The testimonies, when they emerge much later, describe a universe close to psychological torture, where screams, distress, and confusion are observed as much data in a notebook. The stakes, according to the officials, justify these excesses because they imagine themselves on the front line of competition with foreign powers. Yet the short-term fallout is sometimes uncontrollable, so much so that some experimental targets develop irreversible mental disorders. Addictions, paranoia, suicidal thoughts, and chronic anxiety multiply, creating human dramas for which no one wants to assume responsibility. The few voices raised to demand accountability are sidelined or neutralized. Careers are shattered, and a heavy silence surrounds the operations. It even happens that some teams within the program are unaware of the experiments conducted by other branches. So great is the compartmentalization and generalized mistrust. The lack of formal supervision by the U.S. Congress fuels this secrecy, and most political representatives are unaware of the true nature of these programs. In the chain of command, only a few officers, along with the director, have an overall view and give their approval for increasingly extreme research. Internal paranoia sometimes affects those working on the projects. They constantly wonder who might speak out, who might blow the whistle. Those who express qualms are labeled as weak or unreliable. They are reminded of the crucial importance of national security, and the specter of supposedly equally terrifying operations conducted by rival powers is raised. Over time, the logic of psychological arms race justifies almost anything, and scientists see themselves as pioneers of defense, ready to cross moral lines in the name of the greater good. Yet, the relative failure of many experiments, the mental instabilities created in subjects, and the difficulty in reliably reproducing programmed behaviors eventually sow doubt among some executives. It becomes apparent that it is not so simple to break the psyche of a human being to reconstruct it at will. Moreover, unexpected deaths or suicides, such as that of Frank Olson, begin to worry even the most ardent supporters of the project, as they threaten a public scandal if the information ever leaks. It is in this increasingly tense climate that orders for concealment multiply. Researchers are ordered to reduce the traceability of their experiments, to hide or destroy samples and recordings, and to always deny the existence of a centralized program. The shell companies created to fund this work strive to obfuscate the tracks in accounting, and the rare complaints of victims are rendered moot by the lack of tangible elements, as most of the evidence disappears. As the years go by, clandestine practices continue, although the concrete results are not always up to the initial ambitions. The leaders, however, believe they have acquired unique expertise in mind manipulation, even if it remains fraught with uncertainties. The experiments on memory and mental confusion become the priority, as amnesia is seen as a way to create agents or informers who couldn't even disclose what they have done or learned. The associated psychiatric hospitals, including those in Canada, closely examine how to erase the memory of trauma or troubling information, sometimes by subjecting the patient to hundreds of hours of repeated messages during sleep. The idea is to rebuild the personality, but the line with creating dissociated individuals remains thin. The damages to the mental health of these involuntary guinea pigs become a side effect that few people document. In practice, Many subjects leave broken, unable to resume a normal life, or fade into oblivion, embittered, with no means of proving what they have endured. The series of methods, or protocols, remain for the most part highly confidential. Hypnosis sessions, for example, are the subject of reports circulating internally, meticulously detailing the keywords used to induce an extreme state of suggestibility. Experimenters note the ease or difficulty in implanting a false memory or creating a block that prevents the victim from articulating what they just experienced. Sometimes, these techniques are combined with the ingestion of LSD, psychotropics, or sensory isolation to reshape the patient's mind like malleable material. This quest for absolute control is justified by the obsession to gain a decisive advantage in times of war or ideological conflict. Rumors persist about the scenarios envisioned. An agent who could infiltrate a foreign government, commit a clandestine act, and immediately forget his orders, or prisoners of war who would be made totally docile during an interrogation. Over the years, journalists begin to suspect something, but struggle to obtain solid evidence. Program administrators closely monitor their surroundings, and if an investigator approaches too close to the truth, a team is dispatched to obfuscate and discredit the source. The victims, however, are rarely heard, as their testimonies seem too delirious to be believed, lacking tangible support to back their accounts. The few documents in circulation mention a number of unexplained deaths and a marked increase in mental illness. Investigations attempting to connect these elements hit a wall of administrative silence or receive terse responses citing national security. Furthermore, the staff themselves sometimes remain ignorant of the project's entirety. Each researcher receives a fragment of the task, focused on chemistry, psychiatry, hypnosis, or the development of sensory devices. Only a small core of leaders has access to the overall synthesis, coordinates all these methods, hoping to achieve total mastery of human behavior. Some subcontracted laboratories are even located abroad, and researchers there do not always know they are contributing to a mind manipulation program. They are commissioned for specific experiments, provided with generous funding, and assured that the results will serve to improve knowledge of the human mind or to perfect psychiatric treatments. Meanwhile, the true objectives remain hidden. Thus progresses this vast array of clandestine experiments, punctuated by tragedies like that of Frank Olson, which leaves some traces in the collective memory. The program is fueled by this logic of international rivalry, and it draws inspiration from early works that already showed an interest in hypnosis or sensory deprivation. But it plunges ever deeper into practices that are hard to morally justify. The officials often mention the issue of national protection, and no one dares to challenge this reason of state head-on. So, at the ends of hospital corridors and in the basements of institutes, testing continues, notes are taken, evaluations are made, and attempts are made to reduce a human being to a machine with gears that can be reprogrammed. However, the fear of everything being exposed one day leads the officials to multiply document destructions. Official archives are emptied of compromising information, while some confidential notes and personal journals disappear in the process. There is a fear that if a scandal were to erupt, it would reveal not only the illegal scope of this research, but also the suffering inflicted on hundreds, if not thousands of people across the country and even abroad. Despite the dark nature of these practices, they continue to expand until the political context begins to change, and leaks gradually appear, without anyone knowing where they originate from. Information on LSD experiments, on the involvement of psychiatric clinics, and on a clandestine funding system then arouses the curiosity of some observers and the distrust of potential whistleblowers. But at present, everything remains mainly in the shadows because the actors in this project still invest their resources to refine the techniques of psychic rupture and mental programming, convinced that they are serving the nation. They use every discovery, every tragic episode, to refine and polish protocols, determined to explore the boundaries of consciousness, even if it means fracturing it, and without truly considering the human consequences of this concealed escalation. Bare months later, the Watergate scandal breaks out in June 1972, when a team caught breaking into the Democratic Party offices at the Watergate Hotel is apprehended. Quickly, the press and the justice system trace the chain of responsibility back to the White House, revealing illegal practices of surveillance and political sabotage. The consequences of this affair are immense. In August 1974, President Richard Nixon finally resigns to avoid likely impeachment. In this new political climate, the media, Congress, and the public become increasingly wary of federal agencies, particularly those with secret powers like the CIA or the FBI. The thirst for transparency intensifies, and several senators set out to expand investigations to verify if, beyond Watergate, the agency has not committed other abuses. The atmosphere is thus favorable for the exploration of all classified defense files, and this momentum fuels a general movement in favor of parliamentary control. Journalists, encouraged by the example of Washington Post reporters who brought the Watergate affair to the public's attention, multiply investigations. After years of discretion and almost unlimited power, the CIA begins to feel unprecedented pressure. Sex 3.0. In 1975, President Gerald Ford, freshly in place since Nixon's resignation, creates the Rockefeller Commission to examine any illegal actions committed by the CIA on American soil. Nelson Rockefeller, governor of New York and vice president of the United States, is placed at the head of this body. As part of its work, the commission seeks testimonies from former officials and ex-agents of the agency. The stated goal is to assure the American people that their fundamental liberties have not been violated by the very body that is supposed to protect national security. Even if the Rockefeller Commission shows relative caution and avoids digging too deeply into some top-secret aspects, it nevertheless publishes conclusions that hint at research existing on the edges of legality. Political figures from past administrations, doctors contracted by the state, and a few beneficiaries of occult funding then appear in hearings. Budgetary inconsistencies highlight projects with mysterious codenames, and some internal exchanges within the CIA, made public, reveal the seriousness of attempts to manipulate the human psyche. However, numerous pieces are missing to paint a complete picture because the destruction of the archives has already taken its toll. The members of the Rockefeller Commission sense that something significant is hidden, but they do not have formal evidence to expose the full extent of a program that is beginning to be unofficially called MK Ultra. Simultaneously, in the Senate, the famous Church Commission is created under the impetus of Senator Frank Church, a politician from Idaho known for his critical positions on the intelligence community's excesses. The Church Commission aims to conduct an even more thorough investigation into the questionable activities of the CIA and the FBI, ranging from political assassinations to the illegal surveillance of domestic opponents. Compared to the Rockefeller Commission, the Church Commission benefits from a broader mandate and stronger popular support, as exasperation with constitutional violations remains high. Very quickly, testimonies start to pour in. Some former agents, burdened by guilt or driven by a desire for revenge, agree to come clean. Scientists who participated in experiments also begin to reveal snippets of what they did, often citing initial ignorance of the project's real purposes. The Church Commission also uncovers startling budget reports and retrieves some documents that escape destruction, revealing suspicious payments to universities and hospitals. It soon becomes clear that these funds support unconventional psychotropic research, and that the CIA sought to involve reputable institutions, not always fully informing them of the nature of the work. But only a fraction of the archives remains, and it is difficult to obtain concrete descriptions of each stage carried out in the secret laboratories. Nevertheless, the senators discover enough details confirm that a mind control program did exist, and that it involved non-consenting individuals. In 1977, due to a Freedom of Information Act request, several boxes of documents are made public by the CIA, documents that had been improperly filed or forgotten during the purge ordered by Helms in 1973. These files, partial and fragmentary, corroborate some of the Church Commission's suspicions. They reveal internal memorandums discussing the potential of hallucinogenic drugs to break subjects' psychological defenses during interrogations. Other notes mention experiments conducted in prisons, on psychiatric hospital patients, and even on students who were unaware they were participating in research funded by the agency. The press seizes this opportunity to publish more detailed articles, citing specific file numbers and code names. The scandal then becomes a subject of national interest and evokes a profound incomprehension among the population. How is it possible that a government agency tested potentially dangerous substances on its own citizens without their consent and in violation of all ethical considerations? Testimonies from victims begin to circulate, and numerous civil suits are launched, demanding reparations for moral and physical harm. Simultaneously, the international community also discovers this information, as the foreign press widely relays the revelations. In several countries, journalists question the extent of similar experiments, sometimes carried out elsewhere as part of secret partnerships or espionage expertise exchanges. This sudden forced transparency shakes the image of the CIA, and, by extension, that of the American government. The Senate then publishes its report, which confirms the existence of a classified project relying on illicit experimentation methods. The members of the Church Commission describe a massive violation of human rights, mind manipulation techniques, and a culture of secrecy that made the abuses possible. The report is particularly outraged by the instrumentalization of vulnerable patients. It includes passages where individuals placed in an artificial coma were administered highly addictive or hallucinogenic chemicals to study the breakdown of their cognitive abilities. The senators insist on the need to strengthen congressional oversight, adopt stringent laws on medical experiments, and create new ethical rules for intelligence agencies. They also express alarm over the lack of legal safeguards. Pressure mounts for the government to take responsibility and implement profound reforms. Scientific ethics committees are stepping up to demand greater transparency in any project involving human guinea pigs. Faced with the outcry, the American government can no longer simply deny it. Political leaders officially acknowledge the existence of the MK-Ultra program. The CIA director at the time, Stansfield Turner, testified before a parliamentary committee in 1977, admitting that the agency conducted experiments that would today be considered contrary to ethical regulations. He vaguely outlines the major points, admits that part of the reports was indeed destroyed, and pledges to cooperate with Congress to prevent such lapses from happening again. However, this mea culpa remains partial, as many details remain unclear, and no direct responsibility is truly assumed by the protagonists of the time. Government apologies, while historically significant, do not lead to meaningful criminal prosecution. The few individuals identified as the main instigators of the project never face justice for abuse of power or violation of human rights. Some have already retired, others are deceased or untraceable, and there is not much political will to pursue them, as the state fears revealing even more about its secret methods. The families of victims often feel aggrieved, believing that the state merely acknowledges without truly compensating for the harm caused. Following this, a few families and former guinea pigs file lawsuits, but the proceedings remain complex and face numerous hurdles in American law, especially since many pieces of evidence have disappeared. Many plaintiffs can no longer demonstrate the causal link between their psychological or physical suffering and the experiments they underwent, as the documentation has been meticulously destroyed. Courts, initially reluctant to validate these complaints, eventually rule on some cases, sometimes awarding paltry financial compensation that is not commensurate with the severity of the harm suffered. This form of partial reparation does not erase the impression of general impunity. For some citizens, these belated trials, sometimes marred by procedural flaws, are the ultimate proof of the difficulty of enforcing justice when state bodies can invoke secrecy or national security to shield themselves from prosecution. In the end, no one is truly condemned for having organized or overseen such extreme programs. Thus, the episode reinforces, in the public mind, the idea that the CIA, while not omnipotent, is capable of clearly violating democratic rules without facing the usual criminal consequences. Internationally, these revelations also generate widespread distrust of American intelligence services. Some governments wonder how far the United States went, especially during the Cold War, to maintain a psychological or technological advantage. Various hypotheses, more or less verified, circulate. Were similar experiments conducted in other allied countries, taking advantage of defense agreements or clandestinely exchanging data? The few partially declassified documents do not allow for a definitive conclusion, but numerous doubts linger, fueling theories of international surveillance or secret collaborations between services. In the decades that follow, the CIA's reputation remains tarnished by these revelations, and the media frequently refer to this affair when new accusations of torture, brutal methods arise, such as after September 11, 2001. The MKUltra affair becomes a recurring example of the need to monitor intelligence agencies, impose accountability, and systematically question the justification of national security versus fundamental human rights. Today, the legacy of the scandal is also reflected in popular culture. Documentaries, films, novels, and television series refer to it to illustrate the potential drift of institutions when secrecy prevails over transparency. The international public, often fascinated by espionage stories, gradually discovers the history of MKUltra and wonders what limits were crossed, what discoveries were hidden or exploited elsewhere. On an academic level, the revelations have prompted researchers in scientific ethics, psychology, and international law to focus on the absolute importance of informed consent in any research. Institutional review committees, tasked with ensuring that experimental protocols respect human dignity, drew inspiration from the conclusions of the Church Committee and Senate reports to develop today's uncompromising ethical rules. Sex 1.0. Major American universities, shaken at the time by the revelation of their occasional collusion, are now more vigilant when it comes to accepting government contracts. In international medical or psychiatric conferences, the specter of the secret American program still looms. The lesson of the possible collusion between scientific research and political agendas remains etched in memory. However, there is a persistent sense of unfinished business. Many historians and social science researchers suspect that the full scope of the facts has not yet been established, that not everything has been revealed despite official inquiries. The lack of original documents, the extent of the destruction of archives, and the prolonged silence of key actors suggest that a significant portion of the truth remains buried in oral histories or hidden in unindexed archive corners. The absence of criminal prosecutions, perceived by many as a denial of justice, fuels the notion that such practices could potentially reappear under different guises if a climate of fear or asymmetric warfare were to resurface. Nowadays, the MKUltra affair is often cited as a warning about the temptation for a state to permit extreme experimentation in the name of national security, without adequate institutional oversight. Debates on the legitimacy of certain interrogation techniques, on the use of psychological torture, or on imprisonment without trial are thus tinged with this memory. Critical voices remind us that transparency and accountability are not guaranteed by default and require constant vigilance.